Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoris. So we're going to talk about something which is the right to bear arms, which I understand in certain countries, obviously in America and other places as well, even to a certain extent in the UK, can be a contentious and politicised subject. But this isn't a political video, it's a historical video. So very often when I talk about firearms on my channel, I get comments from mostly people in America who lament the fact that people in the UK have relatively restricted access to firearms. And this is often framed within the outlook that we have had our rights taken away and our rights impinged upon. So what I want to look at is basically where the right to bear arms actually comes from. And this might be a surprise to lots of Americans, because lots of Americans believe that it comes from the US Constitution originally, and the Second Amendment. And actually, ironically, it doesn't. It stems from, I mean it does in a direct sense, but it stems from the 1689 Bill of Rights. And you have to recognise, of course, that in 1689, what became the United States, North America, was a series of colonies, some of which were British, some of which were French, Spanish and so on. But the kind of nucleus, the foundation for the right to bear arms, at least in the modern world, and I'll talk about that in a second, the right to bear arms really comes from the British Bill of Rights of 1689, which itself was something which came from the political thinking and philosophies of John Locke, an Englishman. So some of you might be thinking, well, so what is this Bill of Rights of 1689? What does it do? Well, I took the description off a government website, and this is what they have to say about it. The Bill of Rights 1689 is an iron gall ink manuscript written on parchment. It is an original act of the English Parliament and has been in the custody of Parliament since its creation. The bill firmly established the principles of frequent parliaments, free elections and freedom of speech within Parliament, known today as parliamentary privilege. It also includes no right of taxation without Parliament's agreement, freedom from government interference, the right of petition and just treatment of people by courts, very important still in the modern world. The main principles of the Bill of Rights are still in force today, particularly being cited in legal cases. Note that they have obviously kept a lot of elements of the Bill of Rights, much like a constitution, although we don't have a constitution in the UK, but it's still the foundation, even if some bits of it have now been pushed aside, and was used as a model for the US Bill of Rights of 1789. So many modern Americans would assume that all of your rights stem from 1789, but the root of it is actually 1689 in Great Britain. Its influence can also be seen in other documents establishing the rights of humans, such as the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, in regards to the right to bear arms, it should be said that the right to bear arms as written in the British Bill of Rights of 1689 is quite specific. And it is bringing back, because the right to bear arms had actually been taken away, I believe in the aftermath of the English Civil War, and it was the giving back of the right to bear arms specifically for Protestants. So you have to put the 17th century within its correct historical context, of course, and in Britain we had a Protestant monarchy and a Protestant run government, and to a certain extent the Catholic countries of that period were seen as rivals and enemies in many cases, and there was what we would in the modern world call terrorism. So many of you will know of someone called Guy Fawkes, for example. So it was seen at that time that Catholics in Britain, and of course there was the Irish question as well, Catholics in Britain and Ireland were seen as troublemakers and potential sources for rebellion and uprising. So the Bill of Rights gave the right to bear arms specifically to Protestants. Now, the text of the Bill of Rights actually says a couple of things which relate to what we would regard as the right to bear arms. First of all, it says in regards to standing armies. It actually says that it limits the powers of the crown. It says, by raising and keeping a standing army within this kingdom in time of peace, without the consent of Parliament, and quartering soldiers contrary to law. So this is essentially something that goes back to the English Civil War, and what it's doing is it's limiting the crown's powers to have an independent army, and it's bringing the nation back together into a sense that the crown and the parliament and parliament elected officials have to work in conjunction with each other in order to decide when to have a standing army and when not to. So very different to the modern world there. So whilst the government website does talk about the fact that the Bill of Rights of 1689 is the basis for many of our modern rights, clearly that, for example, is completely different to the modern world. And then it talks about the disarming of Protestants, which had happened before. It says, by causing several good subjects, being Protestants, to be disarmed at the same time when Papists, Catholics, were both armed and employed contrary to law. So there were legal restrictions on Catholics owning weapons at that time. And then it goes on to say, and this is the one bit of the text that's normally quoted as the right to bear arms, it says that the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defence suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. So let's just unpack that for a second. So there is a modern perception, I think, in the modern world that in the medieval period and earlier, basically people could own whatever weapons they wanted and do with them whatever they liked. And as I've spoken about in previous videos, this is a misconception. In fact, medieval laws were quite restrictive in many, many ways, especially based on social class. So given that 90-something% of the population were what we would consider as working class, most of them being farm labourers, their rights were incredibly restrictive. And obviously at certain parts of the Middle Ages, even their right to move around the country was restricted, or what kind of jobs they could take. Even what kind of clothes they could wear were restricted in the 14th century. So in terms of weapons, absolutely, you did not, as a common person, let's put the nobility aside because most of us are not nobility, as a common person, you did not necessarily have the right to do with weapons what you liked, and you didn't have the right to own whatever weapons you liked. So as I've described previously, there were specific laws around English cities and what weapons you could own in your house and what weapons you could move around with and travel with or carry. And generally speaking, English people living in cities, and obviously I'll come to that doesn't apply to the agricultural workers who make up the bulk of the population, but people living in cities could not wear swords unless they were knighted or above. So even most men-at-arms weren't knighted in the 14th or 15th century, and legally they weren't supposed to be walking around wearing a sword or carrying a sword in a city at that time, from the 13th century onwards. And so there were legal restrictions about weapons, and we also know, I mean, looking to Europe as a whole, the laws vary a bit. If we look at France or what became Germany, or Italy, the laws did vary from place to place and even sometimes from region to region or city to city. But generally speaking, there were different levels of restriction on what you could own and what you could carry. Now, quite obviously, when we start to get into the firearm age, it does start to change things somewhat because whilst in the age of crossbows and longbows, they were pretty potent. So we look at the Peasants' Revolt, 1381, you could have an uprising of population largely armed with spears and longbows who could still basically take on the king's army. But that becomes even more true in the age of firearms, because firearms really enable a simple person who knows how to load one of these things to take on the military of their own time pretty much on equal terms. Discipline and supply and things like that perhaps aside, but in terms of the actual armament, it really puts them on quite an even footing. But both in the medieval period and through the Renaissance and into the gunpowder age, into the kind of industrial age as well, we do find that certain types of equipment and armaments are not necessarily allowed to be owned by regular people. So in the modern world, in most modern countries, you can't own an Apache helicopter. You can't own, most people can't own, machine guns, okay? Or hand grenades. And the medieval equivalent was also true to an extent, in that it was against the law to be wearing armour, carrying polearms and go into a city, because that would be regarded as potential insurrection. So even in places where you had laws in place where you might be allowed to walk around with a sword, that's one thing. Walking around town with a sword is one thing, but putting armour on and carrying a poleaxe and going into town is a whole different thing. So coming back to firearms, generally speaking, in Britain, there was no firearms licensing or regulation really. In Britain, there was no registering or recording of firearms until 1870. And in fact, I myself, by accident, stumbled across, I was researching 19th century revolvers, and I came across in Hansard a debate that was carried out in Parliament about bringing in specific rules regarding revolvers, because at that time, boys, yes, boys, so teenage boys probably, were saving up their pocket money and buying revolvers and were doing mischiefs with them. Not necessarily crime, but they were causing injuries and causing mayhem and scaring people by firing off revolvers, which they were treating as toys. So it did come to a point in Victorian Britain in 1870 when they decided that firearms needed to start to be regulated in some kind of way. But there was a lot of resistance against this. The people living on big manorial estates who wanted to go and shoot lots of pheasants and do whatever they wanted with their guns. People in the military, obviously, who were usually exempted from these rules anyway, but just generally people who wanted weapons for self-defense or whatever. There was a lot of public resistance to this kind of impetus. But you have to remember that whilst firearms were fairly widespread and easy to obtain in Victorian Britain, they were probably never available in the numbers and in the quantity, and they were probably never as abundant in society as they were in America, for example. So really when we start to see the divergence of the British and American mindsets in regards to firearms is around this period, is in the late Victorian period. And of course you have to remember they're very, very different countries. Britain had a large population in a small island. Many, at that point, much of the population now living in cities, working in factories, this kind of thing. So very, very different living environment. Whereas in 1870 in America, for example, the West was still being opened up. There was a native population which there was some degree of conflict with in certain areas. There were large wild animals like bears and pumas and wolves and coyotes and stuff around. There was a frontier, and there was relatively, for the landmass, a relatively small population. And of course, the US Civil War had only ended recently before that, in the obviously 1860s, and there was a frontier opening up. There was the gold rush. There was a very massive immigration of people from different areas, from both sides, and so there was some degree of internal conflict and lawlessness, frankly. And it's an entirely different country to Britain at that period. So we start to see the divergence at that point of both the laws, but also the ability really for a centralised government, which really you didn't have in the United States at that time. In the same way, you have far more federal system. We have the need and the ability of the British government to impose firearms regulations on the British public. So in 1870 a licence was introduced for anyone who wanted to carry a gun outside their home. But there were no restrictions on keeping firearms in your homes. So in 1860, really, yes, you have the first firearms licence come in Britain, but it was fairly light touch. The next real landmark was in 1903, the 1903 Pistols Act, and that denied ownership to anyone who was drunken or insane in any way, basically. So this was bringing in an element of subjectiveness to the licensing, and it required a license for firearms which had a barrel which was shorter than 9 inches. So in other words, a handgun, so a pistol. So revolvers, pistols of any kind, something that's concealable, basically, if the powers that be, the police, the government, decided that someone was risky in some way, then they would be banned from owning or legally owning a pistol. Obviously, the ways of enforcing this at that period were minimal. Like how that would be monitored, who knows really, quite difficult. And it must be said that in 1911, there was an event which had a very large impact on the public and government sentiment towards firearms ownership. And it was something called the Sydney Street Siege, which was in East London. And this ended with a very bloody gang fight between a gang of Latvian anarchists and the police, and the British police. And in some cases, in these sorts of engagements, the British police, which famously were largely unarmed, they were usually armed with truncheons, but they did have access to firearms, they did have access to swords as well, which I've spoken about in previous videos. When these things happened, and it must say this even comes through to modern times, British police sometimes struggle to bring a firearms response to a firearms event, and this has led to changes in the way that things are done and run. So that had, the 1911 Sydney Street Siege did have an impact on public perception and also the police and government's kind of view of firearms licensing. But one of the biggest things that happened in Britain was World War I, which had an enormous social impact on pretty much every level of British society. But the two main things coming out of World War I that changed how the right to bear arms was viewed in Britain was that, number one, people coming back from World War I were bringing back lots of souvenirs. So the number of firearms and the amount of ammunition suddenly available and appearing in Britain soared up. Okay, lots and lots of people bringing back captured German pistols and all this kind of stuff. Secondly, was the fact that there was a little old thing that happened in a country called Russia, called the Russian Revolution. And around this time, particularly in Europe, probably less so outside of Europe, but particularly in Europe, there was widespread fear of essentially communist uprising. And so, I mean, it's my view, and I'm not going into the political side of this, it's my view that the British government thought, oh crap, we've got lots of armed people, many of whom are dissatisfied and annoyed that they've been fighting a war for 4 years, coming back to Britain, and the Russians over there have just killed their Tsars, and let's disarm them really super quickly. So there we go. That's as political as I will get. And so in 1920 there was the Firearms Act, which introduced the first registration system and allowed local police forces to deny a licence to anyone who they thought was unfitted to be trusted with a firearm. And that really is the root, is the basis of modern UK firearms licensing. The restrictions were tightened slightly in 1937 with the Firearms Act, which banned things like machine guns. And then after that, it becomes kind of tweaking the rules. But 1920, so really it's World War I, the fallout of World War I, and the Bolshevik revolution, the spread of communism that really spurred on this rise of firearms licensing in Britain. Anyway, so to go back to the point, in the medieval period, we do see various forms of arms restrictions, what you could own and what you could carry in what circumstances. So, you know, I've sort of talked about it before, but you can travel with a sword in Chaucer's time in the 14th century, but as soon as you enter London or Canterbury, you have to put that sword away. You can't wear it in the streets, you have to put it in your inn or wherever you're staying, and it has to stay there until you leave. So there was weapon legislation and regulation in the medieval period. Even about fencing schools. So fencing schools in England were banned in cities because they were seen as hubs of uprising and mayhem. And then obviously the English Civil War had a big impact on British society. Ironically, this kind of led with the whole Protestant and Catholic thing, this led to, in the aftermath of the English Civil War, this led to actual re-establishing the right to bear arms for Protestants, and for Protestants only, from 1689, and that is what gave us the modern right to bear arms that is most famous around the world in the 1789 US Bill of Rights, and the so-called Second Amendment. Anyway, there we go. So that was Matt Easton's quick journey through the right to bear arms from a British perspective. This, incidentally, is not registered. It is an antique. This is called Section 58. This is an antique gun. I don't fire it. It's kept only as an antique curio. Our firearms legislation in the UK is very complicated, needlessly so I would say, and also needlessly restrictive in some regards as well. That's another video for another day. Thanks for watching. Give us a like and a subscribe. Share your experiences, knowledge, views, any other information you have below. Feel free to share this video. I'd love it if you do. And click the notifications bell for future videos as well. Be much appreciated. And I'll see you really soon for another video on Scholar Gladiatoria channel. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.